there's two parts of this. We'll go back to the beginning and kind of lay the foundation of that. If the first man, put it in those broad categories, because even if a critic tends to believe in an evolutionary mindset, then somewhere along the line there is, in their theory, a progression to humanity somewhere along that line. Well, if the first man understood his nature, why did he not pass that down to the rest? Obviously, from our perspective, if Adam fully understood, why did he neglect to pass that information on to his kids, grandkids? Man was made by one greater than himself, and thus there are aspects of our being that we cannot fully grasp. Now, there are two things. Why do people do some of the crazy things that they do? Okay, adrenaline. Responsibility. And you recognize that there's a difference in wiring as well. So some people do things that other people can't understand at all. Well, a number of years ago, when one of my boys jumped into a puddle out here, my wife was like, why do you do that? Why did he do that? And I said, I'd explain it to you, but you wouldn't get it. There was a puddle there. He had to jump in it. I get it, some of you will get it, some of you won't. So we don't understand that. And universal law in that sense demands one greater than himself, because we can't figure ourselves out entirely either. Why do we have so much difficulty in communication? Partly because we don't understand ourselves well enough to know how to explain really what's going on, what we're thinking. He did. He made him different for a purpose. And if man is purely an accident that came about through purely random process, how is it possible that he could be responsible for his own behavior? Well, that's part of the argument that some make, denying that there's a God, pushing the denial of God because they want to do what they want to do and claim no responsibility. They want to be able to say, I can do whatever I want to do. Well, if they came about by random chance, there's no rhyme or reason to why they do what they do, and so there's no possible means you could hold them accountable. In addition, many human beings cannot understand themselves or others because they do not accept the biblical record of God making man good, and man rebelling in sin, thus bringing upon himself the fall and the curse. Why do so many people do the evil things that they do? Because of man's fallen sinful nature. We understand much more of what we see because we start with a biblical foundation. Aside from this, there is no consistent explanation of man, of his behavior or how he functions. Well, and it goes beyond just that. There are other aspects of his being. For example, why do some acquire certain diseases and others do not? Now, understand, there are some situations, it's not consistent entirely across the board, but there are some situations where certain behaviors or certain diets or certain characteristics, certain things cause one to be more prone for one thing than somebody else. But that's not universally consistent, and there are many situations where The best of explanation is we don't have an explanation. Man, by the way, is certainly not evolving into better, more functioning human. If evolution were true, man would simply adapt, by the way, to the new altered environment, as we're told, that such is the case. The new altered environment that results from climate change. If evolution were true, man would simply adapt and there'd be no issue whatsoever. So why throw any money at it? Man does not yet fully understand the human psyche, nor every aspect of his metabolic function, and so obviously the explanation is he was made by one greater than himself. We don't know how everything works. And by the way, if you are struggling at times to say, why don't I always get myself? Paul had the same issue where he said, I don't always do the things I want to do. And I don't always do the things I know I should do. But he understood why, because the sin nature remained. So, God made man good, man fell. Thus we have a reasonable explanation for much of the whys of what we observe. So, we're going to go back to Luke chapter 24 and pick up where we left off last week, and then, as time allows, we'll jump to John and his information. Crazy couple of days. Right after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We looked at a little bit last week some of the different intricacies of the various accounts. One angel, two angels. What was the process? How did they go back? Did they go back and forth multiple times to the tomb? Or who told who when? And laid out some of that. So we should have no issue with the record there. Makes good logical sense to me. And so by this point, as John records, Peter and John had gone to the tomb, had carefully observed what they had seen, they believed, and then they had returned to their homes, come back to their homes. And following the instruction of Jesus, at least Mary in particular, if not both Marys, went and would have tracked down the other disciples and told them Jesus was alive and they could meet him. And again, Peter and John had been in their homes, they returned to their homes. It seemed best understood at that particular time. I mean, Jesus had died, been crucified on the cross. Their leaders perished. What are they going to do? And by the way, I would just offer this as, if there's any argument to support my theory in that fact that the disciples had all gone to their homes. If anybody was going to rally the disciples and get them together as a group, it probably would have been Peter. But Peter's at his home. John's at his home. More than likely the others were as well. Particularly with the events of Passover and Sabbath, they likely would have gone back home. But in Luke chapter 24, verse 13, we come to another specific as far as the detail of time, chronological framework. That very day, again, Luke's the initial record here of the resurrection. Jesus would be crucified and the third day rise. They remembered his words, returned from the tomb, and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. And so not only did they tell the disciples, they tell the others. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to be an idle tale. And then, obviously, at this point, Peter rose, ran to the tomb, and looked in. So did John. As John records, they both went, and then they went to their homes. After that happened, that same day, so we're talking the first day of the week, that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were walking, they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. Now, that would tend to dominate the conversation, don't you think? Jesus was crucified. Now, the first day of the week, they get word that he's no longer in the tomb. He's alive. I mean, he said he would rise, and they remember his words, but as it's stated here, it seemed to be an idle tale. Didn't entirely register. They were still somewhat overwhelmed by it. They're talking about it. They were talking and discussing together. While they were doing so, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. So he joins the party, joins conversation. He's walking together with them. That very day, it says two of them. Was it two of the apostles or two of the other? Because if you back up to Luke's record here, told these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Who's all the rest? Well, whoever was on their list. We're not told. But I don't know about you, but if I were one of the apostles, or in particular, one not an apostle but closely connected with the apostles that would have got this message, don't you think there would have been a little hesitation having this conversation with a stranger? You don't know, I mean, the tension with the Roman authorities, the word that's coming out of what actually happened, or what the rumors were going to be unleashed, that the guards simply fell asleep and the disciples stole Jesus away and all of that. Seems like you'd be a little careful to begin that conversation.
Removed for it from this, they maybe would have phrased it or said it differently. This was all fresh at the time.
Mm-hmm.
You would have thought that maybe they would have been more conservative, who they talked to, who they did talk to, what they said, but maybe they were so in awe of everything that has happened that they thought they had to tell everyone.
Right. Or they just started chattering, and maybe a day later they'd have thought, well, I should be a little more careful about this. But yeah, so they're talking, and Jesus draws near and goes with them. They don't recognize him. I find that interesting. I mean, it's not like he wore a disguise, but have you ever encountered someone that you know, but you saw them completely out of the norm? And it takes a little while to register. Is that the case? Or they just they don't recognize him? And he said, "What are you talking about? What's going on?" And they stood still. It's like they just stopped and looked at him. Like, dude, where you been? You have no idea what's going on? Really? One of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And he says, "What things?" If anybody knew what had transpired in the last few days, it was him. And yet, what does he say? He says, "What things?" And they said, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty indeed in word before God and all the people. And how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some of the women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive." Now, kind of sounds from this record that Luke records for us that these two guys didn't really believe what the women were saying. Do you get that? They came back when they did not find his body. They came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But him they didn't see. So, is it true? We don't know.
Back then they had to be the same.
Solomon said, "There's nothing new under the sun." Man seems to demonstrate very similar characteristics over time. So, interesting, they pick up this conversation with a stranger they don't recognize, and he says to them, "Oh, foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had spoken." Now, something should have clicked at this point. Something should have clicked with if they heard Jesus teach at all. Remember, the crowds were constantly amazed at the authority by which he spoke. And you're not going to say that to a stranger, not two against one. "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. The duration of time it would take to walk 7 miles, Jesus goes through the Old Testament and he shows them numerous things related to himself. They draw near the village to which they were going. He acted as if he was going to continue walking. He was going to go further, and they said no. They urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it's toward evening. The day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and then he vanished from their sight. They said, "Didn't our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the Scriptures?" Should have. Well, they arose that same hour, returned to Jerusalem. So they made the journey back in the evening hours. The dusk hours of apparently hoofed it a little quicker. They rose that same hour, returned to Jerusalem, found the 11, and those who were with them gathered together. So by that evening, with all the chatter that's going on, rather than remain in their own homes, they're gathering together now as a group. And they intrude on that gathering, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. Their eyes, they didn't recognize him initially. They shared details of what happened. Jesus rebukes them for not believing, and then that should have been alarming. It wasn't, and when he broke bread and blessed it, they saw him for who he was, and he vanished. And as they were talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them. And Jesus said, "Peace to you." But, see Luke's straightforward record here. Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you," but they were startled and frightened. They thought they saw a spirit. He said, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts arise in your hearts?" What's wrong with you people? Why is it so hard for you to believe what the Scripture said? Why? John chapter 20, verse 19. On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, John gives this perspective on it, the doors being locked, where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. Luke just says they were gathered together. Jesus shows up and scares them. They were already terrified. Okay, if they're gathered together and they're terrified of the Jews and Jesus shows up, doesn't that seem like that should be a good thing? Unless they're still so confused they don't understand what's going on, that their mindset is, "Oh no, if the Romans show up now, they're going to think we took him because here he is." Well, just send Jesus to the door and let him explain to them. On the evening of that same day, first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Again, most likely, this place of gathering was the upper room. Would have been a secured place. locked house, and Jesus finds his way in and is standing among them. Initially, the conversation seems one-sided. Jesus says, "Peace be with you." They're scared. He shows them his hands and side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And he says again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." So the conversation initially is kind of one-sided. But then again, what would you say in that setting if you observed someone who had been crucified on a cross, buried in a tomb, buried in a secure tomb, who is now standing in front of you fully alive, bearing the scars of crucifixion? What would you say? "Hey, where have you been the last few days?" Or what we would likely say as humans that would come off more offensive than we intend: "What are you doing here? How'd you get here?" Yeah. But they had seen Lazarus rise from the dead. Jesus did that. But if Jesus died, how is this possible? And, well, we're not told at this point, other than the simple detail that follows in verse 24, is this: "Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came." Don't know why. Why was he not here and the others were? We just simply have that detail. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." He had a hard time taking them seriously. Thought maybe it was a prank or something. He said, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark, the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." So he has a hard time taking them seriously. "Unless I see for myself, I wouldn't believe." What would you think? What would you think if somebody came and told you a very similar tale as that? You would probably think they're losing it a little bit.
He told his disciples what was going to happen. Were those guys that thick-headed that they didn't understand what was going to happen? Not like they never heard this. I can see someone off the street. But those 12 men that traveled with him 24/7, yes, they had their days where they walked back.
To answer your question, though you might not like the answer, yes, they were. And men haven't changed much. Because Jesus says, "I will never leave you and forsake you," and we have a hard time believing that. He says he will care for those who are his. We doubt that. We have a hard time believing at times. I mean, he makes promises to us that we at times as well struggle to believe. And we have record, and much of it repeated. And in addition to the record, we have the record of him consistently keeping all of his promises, including doing something like this, that Seems a little unbelievable. It's unusual. Yes, they were that thick-headed. Just like us.
You see it right with your own eyes, right in front of you.
Yes.
Like the loaves and the fishes and everything else. It's not explainable.
Yeah,
It's unexplainable.
I know. And yet, aren't we much the same, where if we were to look back carefully, we could put together consistent testimony after testimony after testimony of God doing similar, unusual things in our life that demonstrate His power and His goodness and His presence, and yet we look at a new situation for the coming day and go, not sure He's got this. We have the same struggles at times to trust Him that He can actually do what He said. That He can do the unusual, the impossible in our lives. He's done it, hasn't He? And how many times do we doubt going forward that He can continue to do it? I mean, I'm not going to add up the years that we represent here, the number of us combined, but the testimony is God's taking care of us. Even in our deepest trials, He's been there. We maybe didn't see Him right away, but as we come through, we look back, we can see His hand, we can see His presence, the evidence of His presence, and then we doubt about tomorrow. They did the same. He says, well, why do you worry about tomorrow? He takes care of the little critters that are out in the pasture, and yet we're more important, and we still have doubts at times as to whether or not He can take care of us. It's not just the other side that says, well, if that person gets elected, we're doomed. Right? Might not be nice, but we can still trust Him. We can still be sure that He's going to keep His word, that He can take care of us. How many times have we looked in the mirror at ourselves and said, you can seriously present me to the Father without spot or blemish? Really? He can do that. Yes, they were that thick-headed, and we are descended from them. Others like them. We also are, and I might add at times, I think it's good that we are somewhat hesitant to just naturally believe the unusual and unexpected when there could possibly be another explanation. I mean, we can be told all sorts of bizarre tales of why certain things are the way they are and why certain things happen that don't make any sense. And we should be a little cautious about that. And so naturally, I think as humans, they're not just going to jump and believe the absolute impossible. What would you say? How would you describe an individual today who seems to just believe any crazy tale anybody tells them? Conspiracy theorist, or maybe they're a little daft, maybe they're just, gullible, gullibles written on the ceiling, and then they look up to see if it is. You know? Believe everything they're told. So there is some natural hesitation there. They didn't expect Jesus to be alive. Why? Because they saw him as human and he had died. I mean, it's as simple as that. After my mom died and we did her funeral, if my brother called me on the phone and said, "Hey, Mom just stopped at the house," I would probably call the local authorities and say, "I think he needs an evaluation." Wouldn't that be, I mean, that would be a normal human response in that situation, because that doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. And Thomas kind of fits. He gets the brunt of it all, but the other disciples were actually the same. They didn't believe until they saw. They just had the opportunity of seeing sooner than Thomas did. Unless I see, I'm not going to believe. I'm not going to take your story. While all of this is going on, there's a whole nother side that's beginning to burst onto the scene. And that is the side that occupies much of society, that makes it even more complicated for someone to say, "Yes, I believe the absolute unnatural, impossible." And that is behind-the-scenes political maneuvers with the guards and the story that was going to be perpetrated from that point. We'll pick up with that in Matthew's account of this proceeding next week, and then go on from there. We have every reason to trust his every word all the time. And it's not always as humanly possible as we might wish it to be. But he is trustworthy. Father, thank you for your word, and thank you for the record and the testimony. And yes, we can look back at the disciples and wonder, how could they not get it? For us, it seems so simple. We're removed from it. We take it at face value, and yet the evidence of your presence in our lives, no matter how often it's repeated and clear and profound, seems at times to be diminished as we look at an ever new situation and circumstance. So, Father, help us trust you. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.